Hello and welcome to today's presentation on QuarkXPress 10. I'm going to be introducing you to the new features and demonstrating some of the most important ones to you as well. But before we do that, let's perhaps just do a reset on where we are right now in the market today. This is some research from Pew Research Center from September 2012, and I think what they did that's interesting is surveyed people to ask them how many of them did these particular activities in the past 24 hours. So read a book in print, read a print newspaper, a print magazine, or wrote or received a personal letter. And I guess not surprisingly, over the past decade, those things have gone down, but particularly in the past 5 years, you can see that there's been a huge decline. Of course, that audience didn't go away. The audience has just moved to different devices and different media for consuming content. And in fact, there's good research that shows that consumers that move to those different devices, for example, using e-readers for reading ebooks, actually read more books than they did before they moved to those e-reader devices. And for designers, for publishers, for enterprises, that means that really in order to communicate with that same size audience, you have to now deal with creating content and publishing it across a variety of channels. And of course, as a creative professional, you need tools that enable you to do that in a professional and a high quality way, and you need tools that enable you to do that in an efficient way. With QuarkXPress 9, we took a big step forward in addressing that. We added support as well as for print and for PDF, for EPUB, for Kindle output, as well as the ability to create branded apps to go to the iPad, the iPhone, Android tablets, and smartphones, and the Kindle Fire device. Now with QuarkXPress 10, we've really tried to take a step back and say, well, how can we help our users be more efficient by adding in tools that enable them to develop great design across all of those media? So what you're going to see in the new version, certainly in the initial release, are a lot of features that are applicable across all media channels. So whether you are 100% focused on print, or whether you are 100% focused on ebooks or apps, or if you're doing a little bit of all of those, you're going to find features that are absolutely appropriate for all of those channels. There aren't many software applications that have been around for more than 25 years, and particularly that are still producing leading software in their industries. That has benefits and it has challenges. Even newer competitors that were modern and released a decade ago still have to work hard to stay modern now. We've been modernizing the technology in QuarkXPress for a number of years. The new text engine in QuarkXPress 7 laid the foundation for hanging characters and OpenType and advanced grid systems that followed in version 8. QuarkXPress 8 itself brought new efficient design tools that we've now seen competitors implement. And as we said, QuarkXPress 9 added support for publishing to mobile devices, as well as adding in some new layout automation features. As someone who's used QuarkXPress since version 3, I have to say I'm extremely excited about the new version, not just because of what we've added in terms of new features, but also because this version lays the foundation for many of the things that we want to do in the future. We've been saying publicly that QuarkXPress 10 is new inside and out. Plus, there are more than 50 new and enhanced productivity features that will help you work smarter and faster. So let's start by looking inside. Now, these are very high-level architecture diagrams that I'm going to put up, maybe architecture diagrams even. And this just gives you an idea of some of the key components inside QuarkXPress. So in QuarkXPress 9, firstly, it's a Carbon application. Carbon is the previous API that developers use for developing Mac applications. The current API is called Cocoa, and that's also the API that's used for developing iOS apps as well. And so we've been developing in Carbon for a number of years, and you can see that is kind of the user interface level, if you like, on top. We have an application services level, and we also have this core services level. Something that we implemented a number of years back was started to separate out some of Quark's core technology from QuarkXPress, and the team have been working to do that for a number of years to enable us to deploy our core technology across a range of different products. Now, one of the challenges that we've had with QuarkXPress 9 and earlier being a Carbon application is that really is not the most current version of the API, and that means that as time goes on, new features get added into operating systems, and as an application we're not able to take advantage of that. Plus we see deprecation of some of those features that impacts us, and you may have seen the impact of that in version 9 and earlier. So if we now switch across and just take a look at QuarkXPress 10, you can see that architecturally it's a very different and far more modern architecture for the application. At the top there, we have what we've called QuarkXPress, and you can see immediately that it only talks about Cocoa. So we have moved from being a Carbon application to being a complete Cocoa application in version 10. And that top layer are all features that are specific to QuarkXPress, the user interface, the particular feature implementations. Everything else that you see below that is technology, core technology that's used across a range of our products. So the layout engine, which handles text and typography, multi-channel publishing, output, and the different layouts. And then something that's brand new that we're going to talk about a lot more in this presentation is the new graphics engine. And the graphics engine is handling color management, compositing, font handling, and what we call connection spaces. And then at the very bottom of that, we have a core infrastructure. And each of those layers is also extensible. So you'll be familiar with QuarkXPress extensions. So for example, the spell checker, we have user interface extensions. And we use those just like third-party extension developers do. We then have extensions for our core layout engine that may be used both at a server level as well as inside QuarkXPress. And then the graphics engine is extendable in terms of the kinds of graphics formats that it supports. So let's start by talking about one of those modernization items that we've undertaken, and that's the move to Cocoa. You may ask why we didn't move to Cocoa sooner. Well, the answer is it's a lot of work. In fact, even if you look at iTunes, which is an Apple application, they didn't finally move to be 100% Cocoa, I think, until July 2011. So that was several years after Cocoa was released. And if you look at something like QuarkXPress with millions of lines of code, that's a big job in order to make that move. And actually, I went ahead and asked our developers to give me an idea of what was involved in moving to Cocoa. So they've actually updated 500,000 lines of code and added in another 350,000 new lines of code. Every single dialogue and palette has had to be recreated from new. That's more than 500 dialogues and palettes in multiple languages. And we've also had to go ahead and add in all of our Retina resolution icons as well. That has a number of advantages, and I think some of the most important really is our ability to leverage functionality that's part of the operating system. So for example, we now follow the OS language setting, so whatever you have your system set up in, we will follow that for the user interface languages for QuarkXPress. We can support new features of line and mountain line, such as recent items, dictation, file lists in doc. And it also means we'll be ready with new OS version support. So for example, Mavericks will be supported very soon after it's released. And by the way, if you're wondering, with all of those new lines of code and all of those updated lines of code, does that mean that QuarkXPress is an even bigger application? And the answer is quite the opposite. Part of this process has enabled us to make it far more efficient. So actually the file size of the installer application for QuarkXPress is substantially smaller for version 10 than it was for version 9. So let's talk about the graphics engine. We realized a number of years ago that the graphics engine within QuarkXPress really was not modern enough in terms of what we needed to do with the graphics engine moving forward into the future. So we started an initiative to build a brand new dedicated state-of-the-art graphics engine, which we've called Xenon. And what we've done with Xenon, firstly, is developed a native and very deep understanding of images and vector file formats. So our graphics object model can understand PDFs, Illustrator files, TIFFs, JPEGs, PNGs, Photoshop files. We've implemented something called adaptive resolution, which means you always get the best resolution on screen without having to compromise performance. And in order to do that, we've taken advantage of the very latest processor technology. So the graphics engine is utilizing SSE3 AVX, which is a brand new standard that you'll find implemented in the Intel chips. Multi-core, multi-processing, multi-threaded image handling to make sure that we can get the absolute best out of the hardware that you've already invested in. And of course, the reason you want to have great high resolution and great performance on screen is so that you can get very precise in how you position imported graphics. Now, a rich understanding of PDF means that we can do a lot more with PDFs than we have in the past, and I'll show you that when we get into the demonstration. But rather than putting a preview of a PDF within the layout that you're looking at on screen, we now understand fonts, vectors, colors, layers, gradients, blend modes, and that enables the Xenon graphics engine in QuarkXPress 10 to draw that PDF directly with our graphics engine on the page, rather than just putting a preview representation of that PDF on the page. Things like patterns, complex gradients, radial blends are going to look a lot better on screen as a result. We've also enhanced our understanding of Photoshop files. You'll know that QuarkXPress has had support for Photoshop integration since version 6, and we're probably one of the first companies to actually have that, even ahead of Adobe, in terms of our close integration with Photoshop and our understanding of those file formats. Well, we've gone a step further in version 10 and really been able to map the object model for a Photoshop file into the object model for our graphics engine. So rather than having to go back to the Photoshop file whenever you make changes to layers to clipping paths in QuarkXPress, we already are rendering that file directly on the screen. So you're going to see some big advantages in terms of performance there. And we can also now manipulate TIFF color channels and clipping paths directly in the same way that we have done historically for Photoshop files. And all of that means you're going to get better performance, because we no longer have to go to disk for cached previews of images. Text stays as text, vectors will stay as vectors, and we don't have to go and convert images into RGB in order to put them as they should be on the screen. Those images can stay exactly as they are. We've added in support for high DPI and Retina display, so every element of QuarkXPress 10 has been optimized to take full advantage of high resolution Retina displays, and of course it still works great even if you're not on a Retina display monitor too. We did a lot of work in version 8 on our user interface and usability of the application, and we've been able to move that a lot further forward in version 10, particularly with our move to Cocoa for the user interface. So less dialogues. We've done a lot of work cleaning up menus and bringing some consistency so that hopefully it's easier to navigate. There's new shortcut keys, and I'm going to show you some of the great new features that we have in terms of the workspace environment and how you work with palettes. Since QuarkXPress 8, we've had integrated releases of QuarkXPress for East Asian languages and added in typographic features such as vertical story text, phonetic text reading, Ruby, font sets, character grids, etc. If you wanted to access these in non-East Asian markets, then we had a higher price Plus edition which you could purchase in your region. Even offering that was pretty unique compared to other vendors that expect that you're going to have to go to those East Asian markets and buy a copy of the product there if you want to get access to that functionality. So with QuarkXPress 10, we've decided to simplify this and make East Asian typographic features available to everyone, and I'll show you how that works in our demo. We've also added in a large number of user requested time savers, and in our messaging we talk about the fact that when it comes to design, details matter, and when it comes to design software, I think that's exactly the same. A lot of small things can make a huge difference in terms of efficiency of how you design. So I won't go through all of these features now, but we've added more than 50 new and enhanced features in QuarkXPress 10 for you. And then QR codes are reasonably common now. There's lots of good online tools for creating them, including creating EPS PostScript versions of those. We decided that we would make it even easier, and so we've added in a feature in QuarkXPress 10 that enables you to create QR codes directly inside of QuarkXPress. It creates those as vector objects, which means you can go and color and style them, and we have support for text-based QR codes like web addresses and SMSs, as well as for vCards as well in QR codes. Integration with third-party applications has been a big priority for QuarkXPress for a number of years. In the past few releases, we've been increasing our support for Microsoft Word integration, and we've added two new things of significance in this new version for Microsoft Word. Firstly, we have support for images, whether they're anchored images, embedded, referenced images, and we've also added in support for hyperlinks. So you can have hyperlinks in a Word document. They will get carried through into QuarkXPress and they'll get automatically added into the QuarkXPress hyperlinks palette. So if you're going to go from Word to QuarkXPress to PDF, you can carry those items right through the process. Bezier tools are extremely important when it comes to page layout, obviously, and we've had some strong Bezier tools in QuarkXPress for a number of years. They had a big upgrade in version 8 to bring them far more in line with standard illustration packages, and we had a few more things we wanted to close off there. So 3 things here: the ability to continue an existing path, to close an existing open path, and better support for joining 2 paths. Of course, we're not suggesting QuarkXPress as a replacement for Illustrator, but there are lots of occasions when you need to do work with Bezier lines, and it's far easier to do that work in the context of your layout than doing that in a third-party application and switching tools the entire time. So we think that this is going to make a big difference, and certainly designers I've spoken to say that this will make a big difference for them in terms of how much they use Bezier tools inside of QuarkXPress. With our better and deeper understanding of transparency and PDFs, we now have the ability to pass PDF transparency right through the output process. So QuarkXPress 10 will recognize transparency in an imported PDF. Transparent objects in QuarkXPress can even interact with those placed PDFs, and we will output and carry that live transparency right through to the end of the process. And of course, that gets us a long way towards PDFX4 certification, which you won't be surprised is on the roadmap for the QuarkXPress 10.x timeframe. So with that, let me switch across now to QuarkXPress 10 and show you some features. So here we are in QuarkXPress 10. You can probably see immediately there's a slightly darker color palette to the one that we've had previously. Higher contrast on the icons and a higher contrast difference between the actual design and layout area and the user interface. I'm going to talk more about the user interface elements as we go into the demo. But if we look just firstly at the fact that it's now a fully Cocoa application, one minor thing you can see here, this is the About dialog for QuarkXPress, and you can see it's no longer a rectangular shape. It's actually designed in the shape of the QuarkXPress 10 logo mark and also has some opacity through. That's just a small example of the kind of user interface things you can do once you're working to the Cocoa API instead of Carbon. What's more useful would be to have a look at our file Open Recent. And again, we're now pulling that from the operating system, whereas previously we used to have a Deja Vu extension that we developed to enable us to do that. So that's a far more integrated experience. If I go down to the dock and I control click on the QuarkXPress 10 icon, again, I'm getting the recent file information. If I go to the Apple menu and go recent items, you'll find the QuarkXPress 10 recent item files there. So all things that weren't possible when we were a Carbon application. And it's fully Retina enabled, so all of the user interface has been optimized to work on Retina as well as non-Retina displays. Let's start by talking a bit more about the Xenon graphics engine. And the best way to do that, I think, really is to have a look at a file in QuarkXPress 10. And let's go ahead and look at the same file in QuarkXPress 9. And I think what you'll probably immediately notice is you can see some jagged edges around the outside of this banner. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom right in on part of the image. And you can see the pixelation there on that image in QuarkXPress 9. I'm going to switch across to QuarkXPress 10 and zoom in on the same area of the picture. And you should be able to, even over a web connection, be able to immediately see the difference in quality between those two images. And the reason they're different is the Xenon graphics engine in QuarkXPress 10 will always deliver you the most appropriate resolution for the screen you're looking at, the zoom level, the pan, the position. You don't have to worry about optimizing that image for how it looks on screen. Now, of course, if I switch back to QuarkXPress 9, let's go and just put these two images side by side, make it easier for us to see the difference. Now, of course, in QuarkXPress 9, we also have our preview resolution. So I can go and switch from low resolution to full resolution. And you'll see that immediately that image is much sharper. Now, there was an overhead for that. There's an overhead in terms of time, performance, disk caching. But even when I've gone ahead and switched that into a high resolution preview, you should be able to see that there's a difference in color between the two of them. And I can still see pixelations around the brim of the hat and around the outline of the face here that I just don't see in QuarkXPress 10 with the Xenon graphics engine. Let me get rid of that one and get rid of this one. And then let's go ahead and open up a different image and we'll take a look at vectors. So we'll go and open a vector image in QuarkXPress 9 and then we'll open the same one in 10. And the image I'm going to open up is a PDF image. And if you've worked in QuarkXPress 9 or earlier and placed PDFs on the page, you're probably used to seeing a preview that looks something like this. And it can be a real issue in terms of legibility, particularly if you're trying to position the graphics on the screen here. And what you may have tried to do, of course, is go ahead and switch that preview resolution into full res. But in some cases, as it says here, there's not even enough memory available to be able to set this preview to full resolution. Let's go and look at that exact same document now inside QuarkXPress 10. And how about that for a difference? And the big difference there is the fact that rather than, as in QuarkXPress 9, we were relying on a PDF preview in order to render that on the screen, a TIFF preview of that PDF. In QuarkXPress 10, we're looking directly at the PDF as drawn by the Xenon graphics engine. And if I was to go ahead and zoom right in on this, I mean, the closer you zoom, the higher the quality gets here. So the Xenon graphics engine understands the vectors, it understands the text, the fonts, the blends, the transparency, and it is drawing that directly on the page. So it doesn't matter what zoom level you've got, what position, what your view is of that PDF in this case, you'll always get the absolute maximum quality view of that document. Then I thought maybe just for a bit of fun, why don't we go ahead and open that up in another graphics tool in InDesign CC. And first you'll notice that it took it a few seconds to process that file, but immediately you can see that the on-screen preview of that image is very pixelated indeed. Now, of course, what we can do in InDesign is we can go up to our view menu and we can go to display performance and we can switch from what we have described here as typical display to high quality level display. And as with QuarkXPress 9 and earlier, you can decide whether or not you want to control that display quality on a per object basis or across the whole document. And as soon as I do that, you can see in InDesign now it's really nicely rendered like we saw in QuarkXPress. But here comes the real issue. If I now want to position this, let's just click and hold to move it around. You can see that InDesign has immediately put it back into that low resolution. And that's because typically page layout tools like QuarkXPress 9 and InDesign and earlier are again relying on previews of images on the page, and there is a big performance overhead in order to work natively with an image without rendering it via a preview. But have a look in QuarkXPress 10. Let's do the same. Let's reposition this image and have a look at that. I'm now moving and changing the crop position inside this image box, and I have not got performance issues, and I've still got exactly the same quality. And again, that's because we're rendering that in real time, and that's where being able to take full advantage of the processor capabilities and the latest processing technology really comes into its own. This is a state-of-the-art graphics engine that I know when I talk to our developers about it, they are confident is one of the best, if not the best, most modern graphics engine available for this kind of work. And of course, it's not just working with RGB, it's working with CMYK, it's working with spot colors, etc. So I could show you a load of example with vectors, but we're not going to do that. And I'll leave you to have a play and be able to try it out with your own files and see the difference. Let's close down QuarkXPress 9 and InDesign. And we'll switch back to QuarkXPress. Let's move on and take a look at Word imports. So here I have a QuarkXPress document that has got a series of boxes in it. We'll just go and show our guide so we can see that. And those boxes are linked together. You can see this box flows to this, which flows to this, which flows up to this, etc. So let's go ahead and import the Word document into that. It's going to ask me firstly whether or not I want to use the style sheets in the Word document, so we're going to go ahead and do that. And now not only is it imported all of the Word text and the text formatting, and you can see the style sheets, it's also brought in all of the images from that document as well. And if I'd had hyperlinks, it would have brought in the hyperlinks and added those into the QuarkXPress hyperlinks palette too. By the way, while I'm here, let's just look at one other feature in QuarkXPress. Let's go ahead and just zoom in on this area here. Now, one thing that we've heard from customers, particularly when they're trying to do detailed design work, lots of boxes, the box outlines and edges and handles can get in the way from trying to design and position the content exactly on the page. So we've got a minor new feature in 10, but if I go ahead and just let me hide my guides, you'll know that when I click on a box, that box still gets highlighted, and you can see this outline here, and you can see one of the handles for that box. So I now have a new feature where I can say hide selection. And now, while I'm actually still selected on that box itself, and you can see, my color palette here is changing as I'm clicking around some of these different boxes, I don't ever see that outline. In fact, even if I clicked in the text and highlighted the text, I don't see any highlighting of the text either. So again, I get to see it completely WYSIWYG as it's going to look, rather than having any of those user interface icons or outlines getting in the way. So we'll just go back and turn that on again. You can see immediately my text now is highlighted and I can see the edge of that box. So a great little feature, particularly when you're doing detailed design work and you don't want some of those elements to get in the way of your design. Okay, let's move on and have a look at print preview. We had a lot of users that have asked us for this feature. If we now go to File and go Print, you'll see that I now on the right hand side here have a preview of that document. I can click through the pages to look at the different pages and see how they're going to print. Let's go ahead and just switch out for a different printer. You'll see when I go to this Apple Laser Writer, it turns into grayscale because it knows it's a grayscale printer. Switch it back to a color one, and if I change the paper size here, you'll see the preview outline is changing. This happens to be I know this is an A4 document, so I'll switch it to A4 and you can see that fits nicely. I can go ahead and see things like horizontal page flips, for example. And if I go into registration marks, we'll go and switch our marks on. And again, I can see those registration marks now and how they're going to print. eStation typography. One of the reasons that we haven't given all of our users the ability to have eStation typographical features in QuarkXPress up until now is it can be a little bit pervasive on menus, particularly if you're not working with eStation typography. But we know increasingly a lot of companies in the West are doing eStation language work. So an example here, you can see when I create a new layout and I have my East Asian feature switched on, I get asked what my default story direction is. When I have East Asian feature switched on, I can go ahead and do things like edit my Mojigumi set. And you can see here, you've got a lot of control over vertical and horizontal spacing, something that's very important positioning for East Asian languages. Now, the reason I'm not going to show you that right now is just because it'll save me having to restart QuarkXPress. But if I go to my preferences, you'll see there's a new entry here called East Asian. And if I want to have the East Asian typography features enabled in the user interface, all I have to do is go and check this box and it will ask me to restart QuarkXPress before that becomes enabled. So a really simple way for users that don't need East Asian typography not to see it, and for those that do can now in any version of QuarkXPress go and enable that. What we'll do by default is, depending on your operating system language, we will enable or disable it when you first install QuarkXPress. So if you're in an East Asian country, that user interface will be enabled. If you're not in an East Asian country, it will be disabled. But again, you can go into the preferences and really easily change that at any point. Okay, here I have a document which is has some missing fonts in it. You can see when I click in this text here, down the bottom of my screen in the measurements palette, it's telling me that this is using Helvetica. But if I click in any of this highlighted area, you can see that it's blank. So this is where I happen to have a missing font. As I'm sure you know, when you open QuarkXPress and there are missing fonts, you do get the opportunity to show the text that has that missing font. But once you've opened the document, it can then be a bit of a pain to go and identify all of that, all of the places in the document where fonts might be missing. So this is a really easy way to do that. And of course, you can go into the preferences and you can change the highlighting color that you're using for missing fonts. Now, outside of the graphics engine, the Xenon graphics engine, this is probably my second favorite set of features, and these are all the enhancements that we've made now to the working environment for QuarkXPress 10. Let's go ahead and look at that. I'm just going to go and grab my palettes here, my set of palettes, and if you were observant, you may have noticed that as soon as I dragged that into the center of my page, the whole window behind suddenly expanded itself back out. And that's because the window and the palettes are aware of each other. They know where they exist and the impact of moving or changing one on the other. And if you've ever had instances, and I'm sure you have, where palettes are getting stuck over the top of windows and you're having to move the palettes to see what's underneath the window or vice versa, that can be a real pain. Now, you can do things like drag and drop palettes to reorder them. So if I just drag my colors to the top, I'll put my style sheets back at the top. I'll go and open up another palette here. I can drag and drop palettes into other palette sets like so. And you'll see as I drag it, I get a really nice WYSIWYG preview of what I'm dragging. So I can see what I'm dragging and I can see exactly where it's going to end up. And what I can also do now is dock my palettes on the edge of the screen. So if I just move this over here, you'll see this blue hit area appears. That tells me I'm about to dock this set of palettes onto the right hand side of my screen. If I release that, you can see they're now in place. And again, this window has automatically sized itself to fit in the available space. And if I go and grab the edge of this and move it, what you'll also see is that the window size is moving automatically as I expand and contract those palettes, again because they're aware of their surroundings. It's not just limited to the palettes themselves. I can use the measurements palette and do the same. Let's drag the measurements palette off here. Let's click in some text so we can see it a bit better. I can dock my measurements palette to the top here, which is a little bit Microsoft Office style, or I can drop that down at the bottom. And I can do the same as well with my tools palette. Let's just go ahead and resize that. I can dock my tools at the top, bottom, left or right of the page. And I can even take my tools now and I can actually dock them into this palette set over here so they don't have to occupy their own area of real estate on the screen. Let's put them back where they started. The more observant of you may have noticed that I actually have a little full screen button at the top corner here of my window, so I can now switch QuarkXPress into full screen mode. The menu disappears at the top unless I need it, and I can actually go a step further because I can actually set all of my palettes to auto hide as well to give me the full use of the space. Let's just go away and get rid of all of those. So if I need my tools, they come back. If I need my right-hand palettes here, they come back. But otherwise, I get to use the full expanse of the screen. And if I was working on a couple of different monitors, then I can actually have my palettes on a separate monitor to the display. So let's go ahead and bring all of those back again. We'll exit out of full screen mode. And of course, the auto hide doesn't only work in full screen mode, you can have that in non-full screen mode as well. And one other user interface related thing to point out is we made some improvements to the navigator in QuarkXPress 10. We have shortcut key for invoking it, but if I just go and click my arrow down here, you can see I can make my previews bigger and smaller. You can see I can visually switch between those. I can just simply hit return to jump to that particular page. I've also got navigation elements top and bottom here for moving backwards and forwards through the pages. So a much quicker and easier way with those enhancements to the navigator feature for moving around my document. Creating new style sheets is something that we know customers do on a regular basis. We made some great improvements to this in previous releases. One minor thing that makes a big difference here is when I go ahead and create a new style sheet, typically I do that by clicking my cursor into the text that I want to pick up that style sheet for. I'll go new style sheet, I'll call this my headline. You'll see it's picked up all of the styling from that particular text, but what doesn't usually happen is that it doesn't apply the style sheet that I've just created to the text that I just picked up that styling from. So now in QuarkXPress, if I just click OK, you can see not only have I created the style sheet, but this text that I started in has also picked up that style sheet. Let's do the same for author. And again, you can see it's automatically applied the author style sheet to it. Okay, let's go and have a look at those Bezier improvements. I've got a Bezier shape here that you can see has not got a closed path, which means if I want to make this a solid color as an object, I can't do that. So we'll zoom in, switch across into our pen tool, and let's pick up the first point and close the path. And now if I want to, we can go and switch this into yellow, and you can see I've got a closed path object. Likewise over here, I've actually got two objects. I'm going to go and join those two objects together, pick one point, close that up, and then I'm just going to go item, join endpoints, and now we have again a single object joined up. So a really 2 or 3 great enhancements to Bezier lines and the pen tool, which is going to make it much easier for you to do illustration work directly inside QuarkXPress. Let's talk a little bit about the measurements palette. So one big change in 10 that is certainly fundamental compared to previous versions of QuarkXPress is we have finally retired the modify dialog. That's something that we've had for a number of years, which used to be the one-stop shop for making changes to objects on the page, but we moved a lot of the functionality over the years from that onto the measurements palette. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that that modify dialog was a modal dialog, meaning that if I wanted to make a change, while that dialog was open, I couldn't interact with the page and see those changes. So in QuarkXPress 10, we've moved the rest of the functionality that was on the modified dialog. It's now located on the measurements palette, and the modified dialog has retired. What we've made sure that we did do as part of that process was mapped across the keys, shortcut keys that we know customers use with the modified dialog. So for example, if I go to Command M, and if you watch the measurements palette, you'll see that it immediately jumps me across and into that X coordinates box, as it would have done if I was opening up the modified dialog in previous versions. So you should be able to continue to use those same shortcut keys, and those shortcut keys that were on the modified dialog are now mapped across onto the measurements palette instead. We also have some other new shortcut keys. So for example, there are shortcut keys for showing and hiding the various sides of the screen for your palettes. And there's even an additional option shortcut key that will show one palette or one screen side and hide the others, and vice versa. So that will make it very easy for you to switch between utilizing the full real estate and pulling up the palettes when you need them. If you've set default tool preferences in previous versions of QuarkXPress, you'll know that it's a pretty convoluted process to do that. You used to double click on the tool, that would bring up the preferences. The preferences had a list of tools. You'd click on one of those tools, that would open up the modify dialog, and it was a pretty long process, and it was one where you had to set those tool preferences by numbers rather than visually. So again, we tried to make that much easier in QuarkXPress 10. Just going to go ahead and draw a box on the screen, and let's make some changes to it. We'll make it a dotted box. Let's add some color, change the angle. So we've got a new default shape there now. What I'm going to do is go to my edit menu and go set tool preferences from selected. So it's going to pick up the currently selected object on the page, and it's going to set that as the default for that particular tool. So in this case, the image box tool. And I can do that just for the current layout, or I can do it for all new print layouts in this case, or if I was in an App Studio layout, it would be all new App Studio layouts. So let's do that, and then let's go ahead and let's draw some more. So you can see it's picked up that default for us. If I want to get back to the system default, the installed default, I can just go to edit. I can go restore tool preference, and I can decide whether I want to do that just for the current tool for all the tools, just for the current layout, or for all tools in all layouts. So let's just reset that for the current layout. Draw another box, and you can see now I've got my standard tool setting back again. So a really quick and easy way, which I think is going to make the default tool settings far more widely used than they have been in the past. We've had powerful features for doing space align for a couple of releases now. And one thing we were missing though was the ability to specify a key item that all the other items align against. So we now have that, and the way it works in QuarkXPress 10 is whichever item I select first becomes my key item. So you can see I've selected this green box. I'm now going to go and select the other boxes, and if I go center, you'll see it centered all of those boxes against the green box. If I do the same again, and this time I'll select the blue box first. So that's now become my key item, and I center them. You can see it's now centered against the blue box. So again, a really great usability feature for laying out pages faster. Now for pass-through transparency, there's not too much to show in terms of a demo, but just to make sure that everyone is understanding how that works, just got a very simple visual up on screen right now. So you can see that if I start with transparent objects that are existing inside a PDF, and when we talk about sort of live transparency, that means that those objects can be moved around inside a PDF should you so wish, and the transparency relationships that are caused by those objects overlapping are live. They're rendered and updated live as you move those objects around. So now when you place a PDF on the QuarkXPress page that has transparency objects in it, that could be individual transparency or group transparency relationships, and you export that out as a PDF, the resulting PDF from QuarkXPress will still have those live transparency relationships maintained. Now, what we did previously, of course, was we used to flatten all of that, and we still have very good settings inside the print dialog here for controlling how you flatten objects, etc. But of course, now if you want to maintain that live transparency in the PDF, you can do that. And as I said earlier, that also means that if I have transparent objects that are created in QuarkXPress, they can interact with the transparent objects inside the placed PDFs. Let's go ahead and just create a QR code. So we select a box, go to Utilities, and hopefully everyone is familiar with what a quick response code is, but we'll show you how to create one. We go Make QR Code, and it's immediately asking me for text. So I can do various types of QR code inside this box. So for example, I could do a URL. So create a QR code, which when scanned will take you to that URL. I could do an SMS, and I'll type in an SMS number that it's going to invoke if I happen to scan that particular card. I can do a V card, and a V card is sort of a name and address card that can be contained inside the QR code. But let's go ahead and just create a URL. You'll see it creates a series of boxes actually inside of QuarkXPress. So that means that I can manipulate this now. I could put an image over the top of that within the tolerance that's allowed for a QR code. I can go ahead and change the color of that QR code, and it's all native objects right inside of QuarkXPress. So an even easier way to incorporate QR codes into your print and electronic design work. So layers, a feature again that's been in QuarkXPress for a number of years, but if you do a lot of work with layers, for example, maybe use layers for multilingual catalogs, what we haven't had up until this point is the ability to control layers on master pages and have that information pass through to the rest of the document. So in QuarkXPress 10, we do now support that. I'll bring up my layers palette. And let's switch to the master page. In case you didn't know, you can just click this button down here, and for whichever layout you're in QuarkXPress, it will take you directly to the master page for that particular layout. And I'm going to go ahead on the master page. I'm going to hide that blue layer. Let's now switch back, and you can see that the blue layer has disappeared from this particular layout page. And if we go back, let's reverse that relationship and hide the green layer. We can see the green layer is now hidden. Let's go a step further, and let's go ahead and just draw a box on the page here. And again, let's switch back. And what you can perhaps see is my blue layer text, but you can't see my green layer text. And that's because, again, it's maintained these layer relationships. So you can now see that that green layer is sitting behind there. So it's mapped my new object on the master page between those two layers. So For companies that are working with layers a lot in QuarkXPress, this is going to make layers far more efficient when it comes to working on larger documents. Now, another layer-related feature I want to show you is paste remembers layers. So again, you can see here I've got a number of different layers, 5 in this particular case, and what happened up until version 10 was if I was to copy and paste those onto a new layout, I'm going to go ahead and let's do that now. Let's create a new layout. You can see in my new layout, I only have a single layer, so I don't have any of those other layers. And I'm going to switch this back to kind of our default pre-version 10 behavior. And I'm going to go ahead and just paste those in place. And what you'll see has happened is all of those individual layers, all those objects that were in different layers, are now all inside a single layer. So there are certainly situations where you'd want to do that, but you can imagine if you had a complex document with 12 different layers and you needed to paste it into another document, losing all of those layer relationships would be a real pain. So in QuarkXPress 10, just go and do another layout. I'm going to go up to my preference here for my layers palette. I'm going to say paste remembers layers. And let's go and paste in place again. And you'll see this time it's pasted all the individual objects, but it's also maintained all of those layer relationships. So those layers all now exist individually in the pasted document as well as in the original document. So again, a big time-saving feature if you do a lot of work with layers in QuarkXPress. Flip shapes is a feature that we've had in QuarkXPress since version 8, but you might not necessarily know it unless you tried to flip a shape. And you used to do that, and you still can, by dragging a shape over itself like this. Of course, the downside of that approach is, one, the resulting flip shape doesn't end up in the same place as the original one. 2, I need to figure out what the width of this box or the height of this box was before I dragged it to make sure that it has the same proportions after I've flipped it over itself. So much easier now. I can just go to Item, Flip Shape, Horizontal, and you can see that it's flipped that in exactly the same position for me. And of course that works vertically and horizontally. So much quicker way to flip shapes, but if you want to do the drag over feature, you can still do that as well. And let's talk color. So one of the difficult things when you see color on a page and you see color in the color palette is understanding what kind of color it is. You know, is this text here RGB or is it CMYK? Well, if I click in that now, you'll see that actually over on my color palette, it tells me the answer to that. It tells me that this top text that says RGB actually is CMYK, and you can tell that from the icon here. And if I click in CMYK, you can see that actually it's really RGB. So it tells me over the side here from this icon, and it also will delineate a spot color as well. Let's go ahead and add in a new color. We'll bring up the color wheel that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And that color wheel is a great way to try and select colors, but you know, it doesn't give you a great use of your screen when you're trying to find the right color when you're dealing with such a small space. So in 10, we can now go ahead and make that color wheel full screen. So much easier to drag my cursor around and identify the color that I'm looking for. If I switch across into RGB, I'm sure there's some good reason that in the past 9 versions of QuarkXPress, your RGB values were defined in percentages, but it's always driven me mad. So I'm pleased to say that in version 10, the RGB values now are just straight RGB values, the same as you find in Photoshop and everywhere else. You don't need to get a calculator out to work out a percentage. You can just type the RGB values straight in, and you can also type in a hex value as well. I'm going to switch across to Pantone, and you can see now how this full screen view for that color window makes a real difference to navigating my way around Pantone colors. And we actually have a couple of different ways of viewing this. You can do it in squares, and we can also switch and do it horizontally as well. So you can look at far larger versions of the color to help you make a color selection. And of course you can still type your color in the bottom there and select the Quark Pantone 368U. We'll add that into our color palette. And you can see that it has a little icon there that tells me that that's a spot color as opposed to a CMYK or RGB. So, a really nice visual way to see that. And I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but we've also made some enhancement to our palette sets in QuarkXPress. So we can now go ahead and we can edit palette sets. We can very easily just add shortcut keys by pressing the key that I want to be the shortcut. And I'm going to go ahead and select my App Studio palette set. You'll see it's reconfigured my page and brought up my HTML5 palette, and it's brought up my App Studio publishing palette. So all of the App Studio features are available inside QuarkXPress 10. And if I click on here, you can see this is a slideshow, and immediately my HTML5 palette reflects that and shows me the different states in that slideshow. And of course, we support horizontal and vertical orientations and the ability to synchronize content between those two things. So let's flip back now into our presentation. If you're not familiar with App Studio is the leading cloud-based HTML5 solution for creating branded smartphone and tablet experiences. And we'll be continuing to add new interactive features for App Studio into QuarkXPress 10. The first of those that you'll see in the initial 10.0 release is support for the page flip effect, which is a visually stunning effect that has lots of different applications for use within an app. Now, App Studio itself works with QuarkXPress and InDesign, as well as HTML5 or even XML for automated content creation. So really it's content agnostic in terms of where the content is coming from, and then enables you to output to a range of digital devices. It creates native apps, and HTML5 is used as the interactive container content, but to all intents and purposes from an end consumer point of view, they're not really aware that HTML5 is the technology used there. They have that rich, native, engaging app experience. What's new that you'll see down the bottom there is the word web browser, and that's because we're also going to be bringing the App Studio functionality not only to native apps, but also now to web apps. So that will enable users to get the same native app experience, but through any modern desktop web browser and through mobile web browsers as well. So watch out for that. That's a unique capability that I think is going to take digital publishing to the next level. So just some things to talk about that won't be in QuarkXPress 10. Firstly, we're dropping support for some of the older operating system languages. So OS 10 Leopard and Snow Leopard will be dropping, and also Windows XP and Windows Vista. I was interested to see that actually Windows XP support, general support, ended a number of years ago, and within the next 12 months, Microsoft is even ending its expensive paid for Windows XP extended support. So we figure when the operating system vendors themselves are no longer supporting the operating systems properly, it's a good time for us to drop the support as well. And then I think for obvious reasons, there are a number of digital formats that we're going to be dropping in this release. One, we're dropping Flash and the SWF format. I think we all know that Flash is being superseded by HTML5. We're dropping support for the Blio format, and really finding that customers are much preferring going down the EPUB and the Kindle route or the app route. And we're also dropping support for our web layout space, which is HTML4 based. So I think it probably doesn't take too much to see that some of those are going to be making a comeback in future releases utilizing newer technology, i.e. HTML5. So in terms of which platforms we will support, QuarkXPress 10 will out of the box support OS 10 Lion and Mountain Lion. We'll obviously have support for OS 10 Mavericks very soon after that's released, and I'm sure there'll be other OS versions that will follow, as well as Windows 7 and Windows 8. I expect that you've probably heard this news already, but one of the things that we had to do when we moved to Cocoa with QuarkXPress 10 was take a hard look at legacy file support. There's an enormous overhead within an application to be able to support files that go back 20 plus years. And with version 7 being such a big change for us in terms of file format, the move to Unicode, the addition of features like transparency, that seemed like the right and the most sensible place to make that cutoff. So for version 10, we will only be opening version 7 files and later. Now, if you have older files that you want to update into 10, you can still get to those via version 9. So if you have a license of version 9, you can open those older versions, save them out, and then go from there into version 10. QuarkXPress 10 is available now through all of our usual sales channels, through the Quark online stores, our telesales team, as well as through hundreds of authorized resellers globally. You purchase a cross-platform license. That means it's a Mac or Windows. You can install it on either, and it's dual activation as well. So you could install it, for example, on your work computer and your home computer, or a home computer and a laptop computer with that single license. It's a perpetual license. That means no subscription, no ongoing payments to Quark once you've made your purchase. And the upgrade versions of QuarkXPress 10, you can upgrade from versions 8 or 9 of QuarkXPress to version 10. If you're on any versions earlier than version 8, then you will need to purchase a new full license of QuarkXPress 10. And just to mention that for QuarkXPress 8 users, you are only able to upgrade from version 8 directly to 10 until the end of this year, so until December 31st, 2013. If you want to try out QuarkXPress before you purchase, you can go ahead and download a 30-day test drive version of QuarkXPress, and you can find out more information on the test drive, purchasing, and the new features by visiting www.quark.com/10. So just to recap, this really is a milestone release. It's a milestone in terms of the modernization that's happened inside the application, the work that we've done in terms of usability and the UI visually within the application, but also because it sets the foundation for the future of QuarkXPress and puts us in a really strong position to continue to deliver innovative features to you and a stable and reliable product as we move forward. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you've liked what you've seen in QuarkXPress 10, and I hope you'll be able to join us on the latest version very soon. Thank you.